I'm Alina, I'm 37 years old, and this is the story of how my own parents decided that a party was worth more than my son's life. 5 years ago, they refused to give me $98,000 to save my 4-year-old boy, only to turn around and spend $500,000 on my brother's engagement party. It was my in laws, the people who had the least to give, who sacrificed everything. In the end, it was the success I built from that heartbreak that left my parents with absolutely nothing. To understand the depth of that betrayal, you have to understand the landscape of my family. I grew up in a home with two distinct climates. There was the warm, sunny weather that my younger brother Daniel always seemed to enjoy, and then there was the chilly, overcast shadow that I lived in. My parents, Richard and Catherine, weren't overtly cruel in the way you read about in horror stories. There was no screaming or overt neglect. Their cruelty was quieter, a slow drip of favoritism that eroded my sense of worth over decades. It was in the details, the thousands of tiny decisions that, when stitched together, created a suffocating blanket of inequality. The first time I truly understood the disparity was when it was time for college. I was a good student, graduating with honors from my public high school. I had dreams of attending a prestigious private university known for its arts program. When I brought the acceptance letter to my parents, my father, Richard, looked at the tuition cost and gave a short, sharp laugh. "Elena, that's just not practical," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We're not made of money." He then steered me toward the state university, explaining that taking out student loans was a valuable lesson in responsibility. "It will build character," he'd said, a phrase that would become a familiar refrain. I accepted it, believing that this was just how responsible families operated. I enrolled in the state school, filled out my loan applications, and worked two part-time jobs to cover my living expenses. 2 years later, it was Daniel's turn. Daniel, who had coasted through high school with mediocre grades, decided he wanted to attend an out-of-state private business school with a tuition that was nearly double what my dream school had cost. I remember sitting at the dinner table when he announced it, bracing myself for the lecture on practicality and character building that was sure to come. It never did. My father clapped him on the back, beaming. "An excellent choice, son. A man's career starts with a top-tier education." My mother, Catherine, was already talking about decorating his dorm room. There was no mention of loans, no discussion of practicality. His entire education, including a generous monthly allowance, was paid for without a moment's hesitation. When I later, very cautiously, asked my mother about the difference in their approach, she just patted my hand and said, "Oh, honey, it's different for Daniel. He needs a strong start to take over your father's business one day." The pattern repeated itself endlessly. When we turned 16, I was given my grandmother's old beige sedan. It was 10 years old, smelled faintly of mothballs, and the air conditioning was broken. I was grateful to have a car at all, but the gratitude was tinged with the familiar resignation. For Daniel's 16th birthday 2 years later, a brand new metallic blue sports car was parked in the driveway, a giant red bow on its hood. My father tossed him the keys with a flourish, and my mother filmed the whole thing for the family archives. The reason? "A young man needs a reliable car to build his confidence," my father explained. Family events from birthdays to holidays were orchestrated around Daniel's schedule, his preferences, his friends. My interests were treated as quaint hobbies, while his were treated as serious pursuits. My husband, Mark, a kind and observant elementary school teacher whom I met in my final year of college, saw it immediately. He came from a small, close-knit family where love was distributed as evenly and freely as the air they breathed. His parents, George and Maria, were the warmest people I had ever met. They were retired, a former postal worker and a librarian, and lived in a modest but cozy home they had paid off over 30 years. From the moment they met me, they treated me as their own daughter. Their love was a balm on the quiet wounds my own family had inflicted. For a long time, I just accepted my role. I was the practical daughter, the responsible one. I built my own life with Mark, created my own happiness. I became a freelance marketing consultant, and we saved enough for a down payment on a small starter home in a quiet suburb. When our son Leo was born, the joy he brought was so immense it seemed to push all those old hurts into a distant corner of my mind. With his bright eyes and infectious giggle, our little family felt complete. It felt like enough. I thought the days of needing an "ithing" from my parents were long behind me. I had my own son, and I no longer noticed the chilly shadow I had grown up in. I was wrong. The biggest storm of my life was just over the horizon, and I was about to find out just how cold that shadow could truly get. Life with a 4-year-old is a beautiful kind of chaos. Our days were a whirlwind of crayon masterpieces taped to the fridge, Lego cities that took over the living room floor, and the sweet melodic sound of Leo's laughter echoing through our small house. Mark would come home from teaching his second grade class, his pockets full of confiscated toys and his heart full of funny stories. I had a steady stream of freelance clients, allowing me to work from home and be there for all of Leo's little moments. We weren't rich, but we were profoundly happy. Our world was small, safe, and illuminated by the love we had for our son. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. Leo, who usually had boundless energy, started to get tired easily. He'd be running around the backyard one minute and asking to lie down the next. He became breathless after climbing the stairs. We chalked it up to a growth spurt or a lingering cold. But one afternoon, while he was chasing bubbles in the yard, he suddenly stopped, clutched his chest, and his face went pale. The panic that seized me in that moment was a cold, physical thing. The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, specialist visits, and terrifying tests. We were thrown into a world of medical jargon we didn't understand, trying to stay brave for Leo, who was scared and confused by all the poking and prodding. Finally, we were called into a sterile, unwelcoming office to sit opposite a pediatric cardiologist. He had a kind face, but his eyes were grave. He pulled up an image of a small, beating heart on his monitor and explained the problem. Leo had a rare congenital heart defect, one that had gone undetected until now. The words swam around me: atrioventricular septal defect, surgical intervention, critical window. Then came the final, crushing blow. The doctor explained that while our insurance would cover the hospital stay and a portion of the procedure, the surgeon's fee and specific non-negotiable costs for the specialized equipment required were not covered. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a cost estimate. My eyes scanned the columns of figures, but they all blurred together until they settled on one number at the bottom of the page: $98,000. $98,000. The number felt like a physical wall, an impossible height we could never scale. It might as well have been $1 million. Mark and I had our savings, a modest nest egg for emergencies, but it was nowhere near that amount. We had a little equity in our home, but not enough. We sat in the car in the hospital parking lot, the doctor's words hanging in the air between us. For the first time since we'd met, I saw Mark cry. Not loud, sobbing tears, but silent, steady tears that tracked down his face as he stared blankly through the windshield. We spent the next week in a desperate frenzy. We drained our savings account, we maxed out our credit cards, we applied for medical loans and were rejected due to our modest income-to-debt ratio. Mark even looked into cashing out his teacher's pension, but the penalties were enormous and it wouldn't be enough anyway. We started a GoFundMe page, sharing it with friends and family, but the donations trickled in $10 here, $50 there. It was a beautiful gesture from people who cared, but we both knew it was a drop in an impossibly large ocean. We barely raised $2,000. The wall was still there, just as high as before. Every night I would stand in the doorway of Leo's room, watching his small chest rise and fall as he slept. A war was raging inside his tiny body, and the one thing that could save him was locked behind a door, and the key cost $98,000. Desperation is a strange thing. It strips you of your pride and forces you to consider things you swore you never would. We have to ask them, I said to Mark one night, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't have to say who them was. Mark looked at me, his face etched with worry. Alina, after everything, do you really think they will? They have to, I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. He's their grandson. This is his life we're talking about. Money is just paper to them. This is different. It has to be. So I made the call. My mother answered, her voice light and breezy as she talked about a charity gala she was planning. Swallowing every ounce of my pride, I asked if we could come over to talk about something important. She sounded slightly put out by the inconvenience, but agreed. The next evening, we drove to the house I grew up in. It was less a house and more a mansion, a sprawling stone structure that always felt more like a museum than a home. We were led into the form. Our living room, a place with furniture so expensive and uncomfortable that no one ever actually sat in it. My father, Richard, stood by the fireplace, a glass of something amber in his hand. My mother, Catherine, was perched on the edge of a silk upholstered armchair. I didn't waste time with small talk. My voice trembled as I laid out the situation, the diagnosis, the surgery, the cost. I watched their faces for any sign of empathy, any flicker of grandfatherly or grandmotherly concern. I saw nothing. My father's expression remained neutral, almost bored. My mother's face was a mask of polite sympathy. When I finished, there was a long, heavy silence. My father took a slow sip of his drink. $98,000, he said, the words rolling off his tongue as if he were discussing the price of a car. That's a significant amount of money, Alina. We know, Dad, Mark chimed in, his voice tight. We've tried everything, you're our last hope. My father set his glass down and looked at me, a familiar, condescending glint in his eye. Alina, your mother and I have always believed in financial responsibility. You and Mark chose your career paths, a teacher and a freelance consultant. These are not high-earning professions. Perhaps this is a difficult but necessary lesson in planning for the future. I stared at him dumbfounded. A lesson? This isn't a lesson, Dad. This is our son's life. He's 4 years old. My mother finally spoke, her voice soft and infuriatingly calm. What your father means, dear, is that throwing money at a problem isn't always the answer. Sometimes these things, they're a matter of fate. We have to put our trust in a higher plan. Fate, I choked out the word. You think Leo's life should be left to fate when you have the power to save him. The money is not just sitting in a bank account, Alina, my father cut in, his voice growing colder. It's tied up in investments, in the business. To pull out that much cash would be unwise, it's a risk. A risk. Saving his grandson's life was a financial risk. We left that cold, sterile room with nothing but the hollow echo of their refusal. They hadn't just said no, they had judged us, lectured us, and then hidden behind financial excuses that we both knew were paper thin. As we drove home in stunned silence, I realized my mistake. I had believed that a crisis this big would finally make them see me, see my son, as family. But to them, we were just another line item on a balance sheet, and we had been deemed an unwise investment. The drive home from my parents' house was the quietest 20 minutes of my life. The air in the car was thick with a silence that felt heavier than screaming. Mark held my hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on my skin, but the comfort couldn't penetrate the block of ice that had formed in my chest. We had hit the wall. Our last hope had crumbled into dust, leaving behind nothing but condescending lectures and empty platitudes about fate. The days that followed were a gray, formless fog of despair. We moved through our routines like ghosts. We made Leo his favorite pancakes, but the batter felt like lead in the bowl. We read him bedtime stories, but the words were tasteless ash in our mouths. Every time I looked at my son's beautiful, innocent face, a wave of panic and rage would wash over me. How could I fail him like this? The world had shrunk to the size of that single, insurmountable number, $98,000. About a week after our visit, an email pinged in my inbox. It was from my mother. The subject line was bright and cheerful, wonderful news. For a wild, illogical second, my heart leaped. Had they changed their minds? Had their conscience gotten the better of them? I clicked it open, my breath held tight in my chest. The email was bubbly and filled with exclamation points. It wasn't about Leo. It was about Daniel. He had proposed to his girlfriend of 6 months, a woman from a similarly wealthy family, and she had accepted. The email was a breathless announcement of their engagement. We are just over the moon, my mother wrote. We are planning a little party to celebrate the happy couple, details to follow, but save the date. I stared at the screen, a bitter taste rising in my throat. A party? Of course, in their world, this was wonderful news. In my world, my son couldn't get the surgery he needed to live. The dissonance was so jarring it made me feel physically ill. I closed the laptop without replying. The full weight of the betrayal didn't land until a few days later. I had to drop off some old financial documents that my father had requested for his accountant, a task I was dreading. I timed my visit for the middle of the day, hoping to just leave the envelope with the housekeeper. But as I pulled up, my mother's car was in the driveway and I could see her through the large bay window, talking animatedly on the phone. I took a deep breath and went to the door. Oh, she let me in. Is still on her call and waved me toward the kitchen, mouthing just a minute. As I placed the envelope on the polished granite countertop, I couldn't help but overhear her side of the conversation. She was speaking to a party planner, and her voice was filled with an excitement I hadn't heard from her in years. No, no, the vintage champagne is an absolute must, she was saying. And the orchestra, not a quartet. I want the full orchestra. Yes, that's fine. There was a pause. Listen, Roger, I'm not worried about the cost. Richard and I have set aside a budget of $500,000 for this. We want this to be the event of the season. Daniel and Tiffany deserve nothing less. My blood ran cold. I felt my knees go weak and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. $500,000, $500,000. The number ricocheted around the inside of my skull, shattering every last illusion I might have had. They didn't have $98,000 to save their grandson's life because it was tied up and unwise, but they had 5 times that amount to throw a party for their son. A party for an engagement. My mother finished her call and turned to me, her face flushed with excitement. Can you believe it, Alina? A full orchestra, it's going to be divine. I couldn't speak, I think I just stared at her. The woman who gave birth to me, the woman who could look me in the eye and talk about fate while planning to spend $500,000 on champagne and canapes. The monstrous, cavernous gap between her love for her son and her indifference to me and mine was laid bare. It wasn't a shadow anymore, it was a black hole. I mumbled something about having to leave and practically ran from the house. I made it to my car before the first sob escaped, a raw, ragged sound that seemed to be torn from my very soul. I drove home, though I don't remember the journey. When I stumbled through my front door, Mark took one look at my face and wrapped his arms around me as I completely fell apart. Through broken, heaving sobs, I told him everything. The party, the orchestra, the $500,000. Mark's expression shifted from concern to a quiet, simmering fury I had never seen in him before. He held me until my tears subsided, his jaw tight. Then he stood up, his movements precise and deliberate, and walked into the other room with his phone. I was too drained to even ask what he was doing. I just curled into a ball on the sofa, feeling utterly defeated. An hour later, there was a knock on the door. It was George and Maria, Mark's parents. Their faces were etched with a deep, loving concern. Mark had called them, he had told them everything. Maria came and sat next to me, pulling me into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and unconditional love. George sat opposite us, his kind eyes looking first at me, then at Mark. He cleared his throat and the room fell silent. Alina, Mark, he began, his voice thick with emotion. We heard what happened. We are so sorry that you are going through this. Maria squeezed my hand. No child should have to beg for their life, and no parent should have to beg for their child. Then George looked at Mark and then at me and said the words that would irrevocably change all of our lives. Your mother and I, we've talked it over. The house is paid for. It's been our home for 35 years and we love it, but it's just bricks and mortar. Leo is our grandson. He took a shaky breath and continued. We're selling the house. We called a realtor this afternoon. She said we can get it on the market for a quick sale. It will be more than enough to cover the surgery and leave you with something extra for his recovery. I stared at them speechless. The tears started again, but this time they weren't tears of rage or despair. They were tears of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. No, I whispered, you can't, that's your home, everything you've worked for. We worked for family, Maria said softly, her eyes shining. That house was a means to an end. It gave us a safe place to raise Mark. Now it can give our grandson a chance to live. There is no decision to be made, it's already done. In that moment in my small living room, the true definition of family became crystal clear. It had nothing to do with blood or last names. It wasn't about shared DNA, it was about shared sacrifice. It was about the people who, when you are drowning, don't lecture you about learning to swim, but jump into the freezing water alongside you. My parents, with all their millions, had let us drown, and my in-laws, with nothing but the roof over their heads, had just handed us a life raft. The decision made by George and Maria sent a shockwave of action through our paralytic grief. Suddenly, there was no time for despair. There was only time for logistics. Their realtor was a whirlwind of efficiency, a kind woman who, once she heard the reason for the quick sale, moved mountains to make it happen. An offer was made and accepted within a week. While the paperwork was being processed, the realty company and the buyer agreed to release a portion of the funds from escrow directly to the hospital. It was a stunning act of compassion from strangers. Just like that, the impossible wall had vanished. The surgery was scheduled. The day of Leo's surgery was the longest day of my life. Mark and I sat in a sterile, beige waiting room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and anxiety. George and Maria were with us, a quiet, solid presence of support. They had already started packing up their home of 3.5 decades, yet they never once showed a hint of sadness or regret. Their entire focus was on Leo. Hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Every time a doctor or nurse walked by, our heads would snap up, our hearts pounding. Finally, a surgeon in blue scrubs, her face tired but smiling, came through the doors and called Leo's name. The surgery was a complete success, she said, and the four of us erupted in a tangle of relieved sobs and grateful hugs. He's a strong little fighter. He did wonderfully. Leo's recovery was slow but steady. Seeing him wake up, his color already better, a healthy pink tinge replacing the pale, bluish hue we had grown so accustomed to, was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. We spent our days at the hospital, and in the evenings we helped George and Maria pack boxes. They found a small, clean apartment to rent a few towns over. They spoke of it as a new adventure, their optimism a constant, gentle rebuke to my own parents' selfishness. During this intense emotional time, my phone would buzz with notifications from a world I no longer felt a part of. My mother sent group texts with photos of flower arrangements for the party. Peonies or roses, what do you think, everyone? Daniel sent a link to his and his fiancée's ridiculously lavish online gift registry. They were living in a completely different reality, one where the biggest crisis was a floral choice. Their oblivion was so complete, it was almost impressive. The final straw came a week after Leo was discharged from the hospital. He was home, sleeping soundly in his bed, his heart beating strong and steady. I was watching him, my heart overflowing with a fierce, protective love when my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost ignored it, but a morbid curiosity made me answer. "Elena, darling, I'm so glad I caught you," she began, her voice a whirlwind of cheerful stress. "I am in a complete tizzy. The calligrapher for the invitations needs a final count and you never RSVP'd. And more importantly, I need your opinion on the centerpieces. We're torn between a classic Baccarat crystal vase and a more modern silver sculpture. What do you think would be more impactful?" I stood there listening to her prattle on about vases and guest lists, and something inside me just snapped. It wasn't a loud, violent break, but a quiet, clean severance. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. These people were not my family. Their concerns were not my concerns. We did not share a world, a language, or a moral code. "The centerpieces don't matter," I said, my voice eerily calm. She paused. "What do you mean they don't matter?" "Alina, this is Daniel's engagement party. It's a $500,000 event. Of course it matters." "No," I said, and this time my voice was stronger. "It doesn't matter. None of it does." "Alina, you're being dramatic. What's wrong with you?" "What's wrong is that while you were picking out champagne and orchestras, my son was fighting for his life. While you were debating crystal vases, my in-laws were packing up their entire lives to sell their home to pay for the surgery you refused to help with. You don't get to call me and ask for my opinion on flower arrangements. You don't get to pretend we are a family." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. For the first time, she was speechless. "We won't be coming to the party," I continued. "In fact, we won't be coming to anything ever again. You, Dad, Daniel, you are no longer a part of my life, and you are most certainly no longer a part of Leo's. You had a chance to be his grandparents, and you decided a party was more important, so enjoy the party. Enjoy the champagne and the orchestra and your precious crystal vases." I could hear her starting to sputter, a mixture of indignation and confusion. But we're your parents, you can't just." "I can," I said, and the words felt like the truest thing I had ever said. "I already have." I hung up the phone, then I opened my contacts and blocked her number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked my brother's number. I went to my email and blocked their addresses. I went on social media and removed and blocked them from every platform. With each click, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. It was a digital amputation, and it was liberating. That night, I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I sat down and wrote a single short letter which I copied 3 times. It laid out the facts simply and without emotion: the cost of the surgery, their refusal, the cost of the party, the sale of George and Maria's home. It ended with a simple statement: your actions have made it clear where your priorities lie. As a result, we are prioritizing the well-being of our son by removing you from his life permanently. We wish you the best. I mailed the letters the next day, and then there was silence, a deep, peaceful, healing silence. The storm had passed, the ties were severed. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. The 5 years that followed the severing were a masterclass in rebuilding. The silence from my biological family was absolute, a void that was quickly filled with purpose. The driving force behind everything I did was a simple twofold promise I made to myself. I would repay George and Maria for their boundless generosity, and I would build a life so secure for Mark and Leo that we would never have to depend on anyone else's fickle charity ever again. This wasn't a quest for revenge, it was a quest for fortification. I wasn't trying to tear their house down, I was trying to build my own into an unbreachable fortress. My freelance marketing business became the vessel for this new, ferocious energy. Before, I had been content with a modest roster of clients, enough to pay the bills and allow for flexibility. Now I saw it as a foundation, and I was determined to build an empire upon it. I began working with a focus and intensity I never knew I possessed. I worked while Leo napped. I worked late into the night after Mark and Leo were asleep. I devoured books on business development, digital strategy, and scaling operations. My first big break came about a year in. I took on a small, local tech startup as a client. They had a brilliant product but no idea how to market it. I poured all my energy into their campaign, crafting a narrative that was authentic and compelling. I targeted niche online communities, built a grassroots social media movement, and the product went viral. The startup's sales exploded. Their success became my calling card. Suddenly, I wasn't just a freelancer anymore. I was the strategist who had launched a national brand from a garage. My phone started ringing with offers from bigger companies. The workload became too much for one person. With Mark's full encouragement, I took the biggest leap of my life. I drained my personal savings, the small amount we had left after the hospital bills, and officially incorporated my business. I rented a small office space and hired my first 2 employees. The agency grew faster than I could have ever imagined. My core philosophy was simple: we told honest stories for good companies. We were selective about our clients, and our authenticity resonated in a market saturated with empty slogans. Within 3 years, we were a multi-million-dollar agency with a roster of national clients and 20 employees. The markers of success were surreal at first. We moved out of our small starter home and bought a beautiful, spacious house in a neighborhood with excellent schools. It had a huge backyard where Leo, now a healthy, boisterous 9-year-old, could run and play without ever getting breathless. Mark was still teaching. He loved his job too much to ever give it up. But my success meant he could do it without the financial pressure that burdens so many educators. But the most important moment, the one that truly signified that I had fulfilled my promise, came on a sunny Saturday afternoon about 4 years after the surgery. For years, I had been setting aside a significant portion of my profits into a separate account. George and Maria thought we were just saving aggressively. They had settled happily into their little rental apartment, never once complaining or hinting that they wanted anything more. That afternoon, I told them we were going for a drive to look at a potential new office space. Instead, I pulled up in front of a beautiful, brand new craftsman-style house on a quiet, tree-lined street just a few blocks from our own. It had a wide front porch with a swing and a garden already bursting with flowers. "What do you think of this for an office?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Maria smiled. "Oh, Alina, it's lovely, but isn't it a bit homey for an office?" I turned off the car, pulled a set of keys from my purse, and held them out to George. His brow furrowed in confusion. "It is a home," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "and it's yours." They stared at the keys, then at me, then at the house. The realization dawned on them slowly, and their faces crumpled with a beautiful, disbelieving joy. "We can't accept this," George whispered, his eyes welling up. "You didn't give us a choice when you saved our son," Mark said, stepping out of the car and put. Seeing a hand on his father's shoulder. "So we aren't giving you one now. Welcome home, Mom and Dad." We all cried then, standing on the sidewalk in front of their new home. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a circle finally being closed. We walked them through the house, which I had furnished, right down to stocking the fridge and putting books on the shelves in the living room, many of which were from Maria's old librarian collection that I had carefully bought back from online sellers. That evening, we had our first dinner in their new home. Leo ran through the halls, claiming a spare bedroom as his sleepover room. George sat on his new front porch swing, a look of quiet contentment on his face. Maria was in the kitchen, humming as she arranged her old teapot on the new counter. This was what I had worked for, not the money or the success, but this feeling of safety, of wholeness. We had built our fortress, not of brick and stone, but of love and loyalty. And inside its walls, we were finally completely safe. In the quiet, happy world I had so carefully constructed, news from my former life rarely, if ever, penetrated our walls. I had built such effective barriers that for years I knew almost nothing about the fate of my parents and brother. I didn't seek out information, and none was offered. Our lives moved on a completely separate, parallel track. The first hint that their track was heading for a catastrophic derailment came from an unexpected source. I was at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, an event my company now proudly sponsored every year. An older gentleman, a retired banker who had known my father for years, approached me. "Alina," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "it's wonderful to see you. Your success is the talk of the town. You must have gotten your father's business acumen." I offered a tight, polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." He lowered his voice slightly, a look of concern on his face. "I was so sorry to hear about Richard's troubles. A terrible business, what happened, truly terrible." I feigned a polite ignorance. "Oh, I'm afraid I haven't been in close contact." Mr. Henderson seemed to understand, giving a knowing nod. "Of course, well, it was a classic case of failing to adapt. Richard's company, it was a dinosaur. He made his fortune in high-end domestic manufacturing, but he refused to modernize, refused to invest in new technology, refused to pivot to global markets. He always said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it." Well, it turned out it was broken, and by the time he realized it, it was too late to fix. He went on to explain that a recent economic downturn, combined with two major international competitors who could do the same work for a fraction of the cost, had delivered a fatal 1-2 punch. My father's company, once a titan of industry, had bled money for 2 years straight before collapsing into bankruptcy. "He lost everything, I'm afraid," Mr. Henderson concluded, shaking his head sadly. "The mansion, the investments, all of it, a real shame." I thanked him for his time and moved on, my mind reeling. I didn't feel joy or schadenfreude or even sadness. I felt a strange, detached sense of cosmic balance, as if the universe was simply correcting a long-standing error. My father, who had lectured me on unwise investments, had made the most unwise investment of all. He had bet on the past, and the future had called his bluff. More details trickled in over the next few months through the passive grapevine of old acquaintances. I learned that Daniel's story had taken an equally predictable turn. His wealthy fiancée, Tiffany, had stayed with him just long enough to enjoy the spectacular $500,000 engagement party. But when the family fortune vanished, so did she. Apparently, her family had been more interested in a merger than a marriage. Daniel, who had been handed everything his entire life, was completely unprepared for reality. He had no real skills, no work ethic, and a degree in business that had been paid for by money, not merit. The last I heard, he was working a retail job at a local mall, living in a cheap apartment, and struggling to make ends meet. The golden child's shine had worn off, revealing nothing but common metal underneath. The contrast between their lives and ours was stark and undeniable. While they were losing their foundation of money, we were strengthening our foundation of family. While their world was shrinking, ours was expanding. George and Maria were thriving in their new home, volunteering at the local library and tending to their garden. Mark was named Teacher of the Year at his school. And Leo was the picture of health, a happy, smart, and kind-hearted boy who was adored by his parents and grandparents. One afternoon, Mark and I were sitting on our back deck, watching Leo and his grandfather George work together to build a birdhouse. Their heads were bent-toed. They're in concentration, George patiently showing Leo how to hold a hammer. Maria was sitting with me reading a book. It was a simple, perfect moment of domestic peace. It's funny, isn't it? I said quietly to Mark. They thought money was security, they thought their mansion and their investments were their fortress, but it was all built on sand. Mark looked at the scene in front of us, his father and our son covered in sawdust and smiling. This is a fortress, he said, reaching for my hand. What we have, this can't go bankrupt. He was right, their fall wasn't a tragedy, it was a consequence. They had built their house with selfish, hollow materials and it had simply crumbled under the first real storm. Ours, built with sacrifice, loyalty, and love, was proving to be indestructible. The final test, however, was still to come. The ghosts of the past were about to appear on our doorstep, seeking sanctuary in the very fortress they had refused to help us build. It happened on a crisp autumn Sunday. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air had a clean, cool scent. We had just finished a big family lunch. George and Maria were there as they were most weekends. The house was filled with the lingering aroma of roasted chicken and the sound of Leo explaining the intricate rules of a new board game to his grandmother. Mark was clearing the table, and I was making coffee. It was a scene of perfect, hard-won normalcy. Then the doorbell rang. We weren't expecting anyone. I walked to the door, peering through the peephole. My heart didn't pound, it didn't even flutter, it just went still. Standing on my front porch were two people I hadn't seen in 5 years. It was Richard and Catherine, my parents. They were almost unrecognizable. The years and apparently poverty had not been kind. My father, who had always been so tall and imposing in his tailored suits, was stooped and thin in a worn, ill-fitting coat. His face was sallow, etched with lines of worry I'd never seen before. My mother, who had prized her appearance above all else, looked frail and tired. Her expensive highlights were grown out, revealing dull, graying hair, and her clothes were drab and generic. They were stripped of the armor of wealth, and all that was left were two old, defeated people. I opened the door, I didn't speak, I just waited. "Alina," my father said, his voice raspy and uncertain. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. Can we come in?" I looked past them for a moment, at the manicured lawn, at the solid oak door of the house they had no part in. Then I stepped aside and held the door open. They shuffled in, their eyes darting around the spacious, light-filled foyer, taking in the evidence of a life they knew nothing about. Mark came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He stopped when he saw them, his expression hardening into a polite, impenetrable mask. From the living room, I could see George look up, his warm smile fading as he recognized the visitors. He quietly guided Leo and Maria toward the back of the house, giving us our space. We led them into the formal sitting room, a room we actually used, unlike the one in their old mansion. They sat gingerly on the edge of the sofa, looking deeply uncomfortable. After a long, awkward silence, my mother spoke. "Your home is lovely, Alina." Thank you," I said, my voice even. My father cleared his throat, gathering his courage. "Alina, we need your help." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading shame. "We have nothing left. The business, the house, it's all gone. We're living in a tiny rental and we can barely make rent. We were hoping perhaps you could help us. A loan, just to get back on our feet." There it was, the reason for their pilgrimage, not apology, not remorse, a transaction. I sat opposite them, with Mark standing silently and solidly behind my chair. I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel pity. I felt a profound, almost serene sense of finality. The circle was closing. "Alone," I repeated, the words tasting like irony. "Let's talk about money. I remember a specific number, $98,000. It was the price of your grandson's life, a life you deemed an unwise investment." My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Alina, please, we made a mistake." "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk from the store," I said, my voice as cold and clear as glass. A mistake is taking a wrong turn, choosing to fund a $500,000 party while your 4-year-old grandson needs life-saving surgery is not a mistake. It is a choice. It is a reflection of character. It is a statement of value. You stated in the clearest terms possible that your son's social status was more valuable to you than my son's life. I leaned forward slightly. You want to talk about family? Let me tell you about family. When you shut the door on us, my husband's parents, a retired post Al worker and a librarian, sold the only home they had ever known without a second's hesitation. They gave us everything they had, while you, with all your millions, gave us nothing but a lecture. That is family. I gestured vaguely toward the back of the house, where the happy sounds of Leo's voice could now be heard from the garden. My family is in this house, the family that is built on sacrifice and loyalty, the family that shows up. You aren't a part of that. You forfeited your membership 5 years ago. Tears were streaming down my father's face now. But what are we supposed to do? He whispered. Where are we supposed to go? I stood up, the signal that this conversation was over. I imagine that's a very difficult and painful question, I said, my voice devoid of malice but also of warmth. You are resourceful people. I'm sure you'll figure it out, but you will not be figuring it out with my help or with my money. I walked them to the door. They looked utterly broken, two ghosts being exorcised from a house they would never be welcome in. My success didn't leave you with nothing, I said as they stepped back out into the cold air. Your choices did. You are simply living with the consequences of them. Goodbye. I closed the door, and this time the click of the latch felt like the final word in a long, painful story. I leaned my head against the wood, taking a deep breath. When I turned around, Mark was there. He wrapped me in his arms, and I let myself relax into his embrace. From the garden, I heard Leo laugh, a bright, healthy, beautiful sound. It was the sound of our victory. It was the sound of a future they had no part in. It was the sound of home. So I have a question for you all who are listening. Is there a point where family is no longer defined by blood but by action? And at what point is forgiveness no longer a virtue but a betrayal of yourself and those who truly stood by you?